Right. We will begin then. I can see we have a couple of people in. Do feel free to say hi to everyone. Let me just do a quick tweet to let everyone know that I've gone live. Today we are going to be talking, as you've probably guessed, about the new Prime Minister, or rather the new leader of the Conservative Party, shortly to be our new Prime Minister as of tomorrow. So yes, that is the subject matter of today. I'm going to be about for about an hour just talking through what we know of Liz Truss's policy, what we know of her approaches, how she's going to handle things, and also what the sort of longer term prospects are. Always an interesting one to try and explain, of course, and explore. So yes, so we have a new Prime Minister. Liz Truss, formerly the Foreign Secretary, is now Tory leader as of about lunchtime today. It was announced about 1:45 in the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre. It caused no end of joy because a lot of commentators pointed out it's the first time we've had a Prime Minister with the same name as the reigning monarch for quite a long time. Approximately, I think William was the last one, King William the Third, I think. Who was it? Lord... I can't remember. It was one of the peer Prime Ministers who shared the same name. So this is a first and ready to go for a long time. So... she beat out Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor, to the role. It's not exactly been a close campaign for the last few weeks of it. You will remember that Rishi Sunak was, in fact, top in the MPs' vote by quite a lot, by about 2/3. But it became quickly quite obvious that that was not going to hold for the vote of the membership. Sunak being relatively unpopular with the membership due to some of the things he did under Boris Johnson's government. Truss, by not rocking the boat, definitely secured herself some more votes there. So yes, she won by 54.6 to his, what would that be, 46 point... no... 42 points. It was quite close, is my point. I should have that figure to hand, but I didn't have it offhand here. But yes, it was actually closer than I was expecting. I was expecting her to win, but I was expecting to win by more. I was expecting her to push over the 60% mark. We'll come back to what that might mean for her later, because it's not entirely a good thing. But we'll discuss that when the time comes. So Sir Graham Brady got up and he gave his little speech about how he was very honoured and pleased to be revealing such private information to the party. Announced the result, and then Liz Truss, who had been told beforehand, she came in with rather more of a smile on her face than Rishi Sunak did, but she came out and she gave her speech. She didn't shake hands with anyone, which is interesting. Usually you expect that they would shake hands with the defeated opposition, give their spouse a bit of a hug. She didn't do that. Mr. Truss is a notably private person, not unlike Philip Hammond, actually, although Philip Hammond was... I was going to say was willing to be seen with his wife in public, but that sounds possibly a little more dramatic than I intend. That's not quite what I mean. But yes, he was a bit more public. It'll be interesting to see, I think, how much attention he gets in the immediate future. So yes, no handshaking. She was all business. Again, probably trying to retain that Thatcher-like cool image, although quite how successful that has been and will be is one thing separate. She then got up and gave her victory speech. It has to be said, it wasn't a world shaker. In fact, it was quite astonishingly bland, boring, dull, and uninteresting, her victory speech. The I'll go through the key themes of her victory speech because they will give us a little bit of a clue as to where she might want to be going with this. But yes, it was very dull, very boring. Now, it has to be said, Liz Truss is not the finest public speaker in the world. She never has been. She probably never will be, although she did improve a little bit over the course of the contest, because I think she realised quite how bad she was in the first debate, so she brushed up and spent some time rehearsing for future occasions. But even by her standards, this victory speech, it felt very flat, it felt very bland. It wasn't the usual barnstormer of a thing we might expect from a victorious political candidate who is tomorrow going to be Prime Minister. So she majored on 3 themes. The first of them was Boris Johnson. She gave some quite effusive praise of him. He had crushed Jeremy Corbyn. He had beaten Vladimir Putin. And he would be remembered fondly from Kiev to Carlisle, she said. Note Carlisle, as in England. She didn't go for anywhere north of the border. It wasn't Kiev to Kirkwall, for example. So clearly a bit of honesty on her part there. She left a space for applause there. In retrospect, that was probably a bad idea because not many people did. In fact, she was more or less the only one who seemed to be expecting applause there. She waited about, 3 seconds, and then all of a sudden there was a brief outburst of applause from what seemed like one person. So probably not the response Boris would have been hoping for, but probably the one inevitably he would get, because at this stage he is really still not very popular with the party for what he's done to their numbers. That being said, and we may come back to this in the future, it is of course possible that he may want to make a comeback. We shall have to see what that looks like and if that can shape up for him. So yes, Kiev to Carlisle, very popular. Anywhere north of the border, not so. That situation is unlikely to change. Nicola Sturgeon did put out quite a gracious tweet congratulating Liz Truss and saying that she would of course attempt to work with her as best she can. Rather tokenistic, it has to be said. They are never going to agree on things, and the war of words, particularly over the purported next referendum on Scottish independence, has already started. I know there's already been a bit of qualification on. There might be restrictions on the vote. They'll have to demonstrate over 60% to get independence and things. Naturally, Nicola is not keen on that. Personally, I think it's a very good idea. I've always been very much of the opinion that Scottish independence and breaking up the union and things should be done more or less as the Canadians do it in Quebec with the Clarity Act over there. But that's a separate issue and not perhaps for this debate. But nevertheless, that's where that one stands. I noticed we've got a few more people coming in. Do feel free to say hello in chat, and I shall. If you have any questions or anything, do put them in there as well, and I will get around to answering them as quickly as I can. So, policy priorities was the second part of Liz Truss. Now we're going to come back to policy in just a second to look a bit more in depth at some of the policies that she is proposing. But she mentioned 3 in particular in her speech, which I think we can take as being her priorities. The first one of these is economic growth. Again, we'll come back to this and do this in a little bit more detail in just a couple of minutes. Economic growth. I always find the economic growth argument a slightly an odd one, because there aren't many people who go into any position of government saying that they are, what do you stand for? Well, I stand for economic shrinkage and the wastage of the public purse. There's not many people who go into it with that. Maybe it would be more honest if people did, but yes. So economic growth, perfectly predictable, especially from this government, who have been very keen that we've had a tragic lack of growth in the last 15 years, and have, as always, forgotten to mention that they were in power for 12 of them. So at least some of that blame has to be attributable to them, but they've forgotten to do that again. But it's all right. Liz Truss is here now, and I'm sure things are going to be different. Yeah, I know. I'm trying to be optimistic, okay? So, second one, energy. This was another one. Obviously, the energy crisis at the moment is starting to bite hard on many of us. People are seeing their bills going up. The energy caps keep going up. Not necessarily a good thing. Well, not necessarily a good thing. And of course it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for anyone, that, really. But it does seem to be the case. We obviously know they're going to have to do something about it. We'll get into in a second what that's likely to be, because I'm not massively hopeful given what we've heard so far, but we'll talk about that in a second. Final policy priority, excuse me, the NHS. Now, it's a bit difficult to tell what to do with this one because people put the NHS in there anyway. You'd expect them to have the NHS in there. It is practically obligatory to mention the NHS and that you're going to be funding the NHS properly. In the UK, where not doing so is heresy against the holy NHS. So yes, good to see the NHS getting a shout out there. We shall come to the NHS in a second because the NHS is going to be a very, very, very big problem. I'll give you 3 verys on that one. Is going to be a very big problem coming up soon. So the final point, and really probably the most notable point from my perspective, she made the claim, we are going to get ready to deliver a Conservative victory at the next election in 2024. Now, of course, there's been a lot of speculation about when the next election would be. 2024 is pretty much the last time they are allowed to have one. Actually, I think they could have one, in January 25, but that's probably pushing it a little bit. So we know now that was a clear indication, really, that there is not going to be an early general election. Now, in my view, this is a bit foolish, actually, because I honestly think that she might well be advised to call an early general election, possibly as early as the autumn, because they'd still lose it, but they might lose it by less than they will one in 2024. So I was a bit disappointed to see that. I'll be honest, I was holding out hope that she might see reason, see sense, and go and hold the election sometime soon. Not only because it would get rid of them, but because if they want to win, that's probably the best chance they've got. It's not great, but it's going to be even worse after a harsh winter. So, yes, victory speech, dull, boring, not very interesting, not really much of interest said, other than she's trying and hold out for the 2024 election. Of course, whether that actually happens or not is a slightly different matter. She could be pressured into it beforehand. There is another point there, which we'll come to again at the end, I think, because it's in the sort of distant future. So I think we'll start now. We'll have a quick look at the policies. So in no particular order, except the one I've carefully worked out. The first and obviously most pressing issue that Liz Truss is facing is taxation and the cost of living, particularly the cost of living crisis. Now, why is taxation lumped in here? Well, Liz Truss is very keen on the idea of promoting growth through reducing tax. And I'm sure, in principle, we all like that idea. I mean, who wouldn't want to be paying less tax? But there is, of course, a problem with this, which is that, firstly, cutting taxes is likely to increase inflation. Now, inflation is already more or less totally out of control. And cutting taxes further is only going to increase that, and that is a big problem. Now, Liz Truss says it needn't do so. The economist she has supporting her on this, and I say the economist very advisedly because it really is just one economist. It's the estimable Patrick Minford. He of Brexit will be great for the economy, while all the other economists were saying, "Oh, I don't think so." So, yes, not perhaps the best person to have as your more or less only supporter on that. But yes, so taxation, will cutting tax improve the situation? Probably not. One of the reasons it won't do is because any tax cuts will be sufficiently minor that they won't, in fact, really have any impact. If your bills are going up by 200 quid a month, which I think is optimistic at this point, but if they are, then you getting 3 quid back from taxes is not going to be massively helpful. Yep, I see a question coming in there. I will come to that in a second. Yes, but the other thing about taxation and cutting taxation is that it benefits mostly the rich. Now, she was actually asked about this yesterday on Laura Kuenssberg's new show, the new Sunday Politics show. She was asked, is it fair? Is it fair that the rich should be more benefited than the poor on this. She declared that it was, which was an interesting tactic. I don't know whether that one was a spur of the moment thing, which she does have a tendency to do. She has a tendency to be a bit spur of the moment and then blame other people for it later. But nevertheless, she said it was fair. It'll be interesting to see if that position still holds when the public start asking questions, and I think that might be a different question then, because I don't think she'd be able to go to them with that. The other thing is prevarication on handouts. Now, we've heard a lot about, she's been quite dismissive about handouts and this idea of giving people money to help them pay their electricity bills. I think she's now in a position where actually that's more likely, if only because it's really going to have to happen at some point. I was always a bit perplexed as to why she went all in on there's not going to be any handouts, because it seems to me illogical that they're going to be forced to that position, at some point, unless, and if they don't, they're going to be, standing around doing nothing while hundreds of thousands of people die. So it always seemed to me a bit odd to be going all out on that one, but nevertheless. That is the big question now. What will the immediate relief package look like? And I suspect there will be some degree of handouts. There have been a few whispers they might be essentially adopting the Labour package, the Labour policy. It would be a hell of a victory for Labour, but they might be able to do something else. But of course, the big question with both of those things, all of those things, is where is the money coming from? What money is there for this, and where is it coming from? Because the truth is, all of this has to be paid for. It has to be paid for somewhere. If you're cutting tax, that's great, but that's money coming out of the public purse. If you're doing handouts, that's money. You've got to come from somewhere. Now, the obvious solution is the windfall tax. We've had a lot of talk about this. Windfall tax is probably a good idea. If nothing else, it would be a PR victory. It would make people appreciate that the government is doing something. It would also take the edge off, because it is very frustrating when you see the energy companies all talking about, we've made 14 billion in profit this year, etc., etc. That's quite annoying if you're really struggling to live. So I think that's one obvious place. It's not the one they've gone for yet. Is it one they'll be dragged to? It quite possibly is, I think. But again, we'll see how long they can resist that, and we'll see how the energy firms' lobbying turns out on that one. So yes, just before I go on to the next one, which is climate and energy, so any green people stick around closely. Got a question from Pirellius here in chat. Don't want to interrupt the flow. Quick question. Some talk about the Tory leadership format being untenable going forward. 2 months of lame duck government is not a great way of doing things. Any news is on whether there's likely to be a change and how that might happen? A vote by the 1922 committee, for example. Yeah, I mean, this is a big one. I've said this all along. It is utterly ludicrous to hold the leadership election in the way it's been held. It's not fine when you're in opposition, but it's especially bad when you're in government. It's especially bad when you're in government at a time of crisis. It is an indulgence. It's grotesque to have this period of 6 weeks where nothing gets done and bills are rising and everything is going to pot. It is utterly preposterous. I am not a fan of giving the membership a vote for the leadership. As far as I'm concerned, it should be a vote of MPs alone, because ultimately they're the ones who have to work with them. It's designed, I think, to give a veneer of democracy to the process, so they can say this is a democratic process. But it's really a nonsense, because, it's not it is a democratic process, but it's a sufficiently limited one that, I think it was 0.12% of the population got a vote in this one. When you get to the points when it's 0.12% of the population, I just don't think it's worth it. Just have the MPs do it, because otherwise you do get situations like we had with Jeremy Corbyn a few years back, where you have the MPs who have voted no confidence, who very obviously don't have confidence in them, but the membership keeps shoving them back. Now, of course, in the Conservative Party, it used to be done that way. It used to be. I mean, initially, it was... It wasn't even a vote of the membership. It was just the Grundies, the senior figures in the party got together in a room, had a discussion. Whose turn is it now? Oh, it's Butler's, or it's whatever. That stopped after Alec Douglas-Home became Prime Minister, who was the last fond of Douglas-Home, if only because he is the last Prime Minister to serve whilst a member of the House of Lords, although he resigned from the Lords 4 days into his premiership to take up a seat in the Commons. But he had a pretty disastrous. He didn't even last a year as PM, and he changed. They changed the voting system so that MPs got a vote, secret ballot of MPs. Great, that's what you want. And then in 1995 or 99, I can't remember, 99, I think. They changed it to the system, well, broadly the system they use now, whereby you have endless rounds of internal voting amongst MPs to whittle it down to 2 and then out to the membership. Yeah, so in answer to your question, it is a stupid format. It shouldn't be the case. It is disastrous for government and good administration. Is it likely to change? I suspect substantively no. I think there will be tweaks. Geoffrey Clifton Brown, who's the treasurer of the 1922, was on the news this morning saying it clearly was too long a process and they should really do something about speeding it up. So I suspect they will speed it up in the future. I don't think they'll change it back to the way it should be. Frankly, it would be a bit too much fuss. But yeah, vote change. Vote change, I believe, could be done by the 1922 itself. I don't think it would have to go to conference. But I'm happy to be corrected on that. So yeah, it might do. I suspect it'll be moving deck chairs on the moving chairs on the deck of the Titanic, though. It'll be tinkering around the edges rather than dealing with the actual problem. You may well be inclined to think that's very much this entire government's modus operandi. But nevertheless. So yes, back to the thing. If there are any other questions, do fling them in and I will get to them. Climate and energy. Okay, climate and energy is a really interesting one for Liz Truss, actually, because she has made some pretty firm commitments to respect the net zero commitments, the net zero by 2050. But it has to be said she's never been on the environmental wing of the party. She's never been particularly committed to environmentalism as a thing. She also is a big supporter of fracking, which is obviously very controversial. I do not know enough about the science of fracking to be able to authoritatively comment on that. However, what I have seen, I do know that I think it needs looking into a bit more detail before we start just doing it anywhere. But she's also a fan of opening more drilling up for oil and gas in the North Sea, which I think calls her climate credentials into question quite a lot. Various members of her camp have talked a lot about the fact that they want to keep funding renewables, things like that. It's kind of a bit of a null answer, though, if you're going to be drilling all the oil anyway. The other big one is she's a big, having talked about supporting renewables, she is a big opponent of onshore wind and solar. Solar, she said a couple of weeks ago, was one of the most awful things you could see in a field. It was a field that should be used for farming, and you see these dreadful solar panels everywhere. Now, I live in somewhere where there are a lot of solar panels in the field. I quite like it. I also quite like the planet not being on fire and being habitable for humans in the future, but maybe that makes me an outlier. For her, she evidently doesn't rate it. Onshore wind is the other interesting one. Onshore wind is difficult. I've actually done in my day job, I've done a fair amount on this because the government is in a very different position to the public and even to Tory members on onshore wind. The government very much feel that that onshore wind is disliked, is hated by people, by the general public, and they don't want it, and communities don't want wind farms close to them. So it's essentially banned. The development of any significant onshore wind is essentially banned under the planning processes and the planning regulations. Actually, when you go out to the public, from a neutral perspective, it's something like 76 to 80% of people say they'd be perfectly happy to have an onshore wind farm next to their town. So actually, it's a weird one because it's one of these ones where the government is here and determined to say, nobody wants this, and everyone else is going, yeah, actually, we don't mind. Actually, we quite like it. If it's going to bring electricity costs down, it's good for strategy, then fine. So yeah, that's a bizarre one there. I don't think that's going to change. She's far too ideological for that to change as a method. Although I think it is indicative of the fact the government should definitely be talking to the public more and finding out what they actually want, which they're not very good at. Energy, the long-term strategy as well, long-term energy strategy. We had that. That was published a few months ago now. It wasn't great. It wasn't much of a long-term strategy. Obviously, that's been thrown into that was accelerated essentially because of the war in Ukraine and the need to wean ourselves off Russian gas. There's a lot of questions there, and I suspect that might end up being quite a big issue at the next election, is how we deal with energy, and it might well be a point at which the public gets, or it will be the point at which the public get the chance to speak their minds on that one, and we hope that 76 to 80% of the people don't forget that the one party doesn't like it. So yes, climate and energy. Mixed bag, I think it's fair to say. I mean, it's very important to remember, of course, that there is a very strong green movement on the Conservative benches. We have this idea. It's quite an interesting one. The history of environmentalism and conservation generally is a very interesting one because, of course, these days we mostly associate it with the left wing. This idea that you scratch away the green and there is a red in there. But, of course, traditionally, it was quite the opposite. I mean, traditionally... it was very much a right-wing obsession. I mean, in America, Teddy Roosevelt led on it, and in the UK, it was always a very countryside alliance sort of thing. We want to preserve all the greenery, and that was a very right-wing thing. It's a weird state, but there is still quite a strong movement. It'll be interesting to see if they can get any sort of commitments, any firm commitments out of Truss and her folks on that. There. So that's climate and energy. The next one is the third one that we listed on her policy priorities at the top, the NHS. Now, the NHS is, it's the one you have to talk about. It's the one you have to be supportive of. Now, the NHS is in very big trouble at the moment. It's something that not a lot of the general public have yet realised. It's not become big in the news stories, and I think my inclination is that's because it's not the point in the narrative where it becomes important yet. But it is important. The NHS is basically already operating at beyond peak winter capacity. There is no room at the inn. They are already at the point that you would expect them to be at in the worst and deepest of winters. It is, of course, September. We've not got into the winter yet, and the NHS is already at that point. It is already at the point that you would expect. The NHS is in very big trouble. Now, there are many reasons for this. Part of the reason is that there's a lot of beds being occupied by people who should be in social care, but who can't be because social care is not properly funded. NHS funding, always an issue as well. Liz Truss says she's going to fund the NHS. Of course, one of the taxes she wants to cut is the national insurance rise, which was being levied to fund the NHS. So again, there's going to be more of a deficit there. It'll be interesting to see where that comes from, where they fill that gap with. I'm not sure. They haven't really given us any clear answers on that other than to say they are going to fund it properly. So yes, the NHS, it's in this poor state. When we get into winter, we'll have flu, we'll have COVID back again. It's not going to be... my advice is very much don't get ill this winter, because don't get seriously ill this winter, which is a shame, really, because we're about to have massive heating problems. So you're going to get a lot of people getting ill from that as well. So this winter there is, I think, going to be a pretty hefty crisis. Now, the other thing to think about with the NHS as well is the NHS is currently undergoing quite a big reorganisation. I won't get into the depths of it, it's quite arcane, but the old clinical commissioning groups, which are responsible for providing, commissioning health service provision, have now been replaced by integrated care systems, which are these grand, much bigger organisations. So it's still trying to scrabble around with that, and that's sort of it's administrative and managerial, but it's going to need resources to cope with that on top of the resources needed to cope with the crisis as is. So NHS, not good. They're going to need a good answer to that. As of this moment, I haven't seen a good answer from them on that. It's going to be very interesting to see what they come up with in the end. Hello to anyone new, I should say. If anyone new has come in, please do say hi in chat. If you have any questions, put them in there. I should probably do a like and follow or whatever it is you do on these things. I've never been very good at that, but if you do like this, I do a reasonable amount of this political commentary, especially around elections. Some of you may recall I've done previously whenever we have an election. I do a pretty much 24-hour watching the results come in and talking about them as they do. So if that's your bag, if you're as square as I am, then do feel free to do that. So the next issue, levelling up. Now, levelling up is a really interesting one. Levelling up is obviously one of the sort of flagship policies of the government. You know, they go to level up all parts of the country. Levelling up so far has been very restricted. It's been a lot of individual projects. Some of them slightly dodgily oriented, in that there's been a lot of money that's gone to Conservative constituencies, even those that aren't really that deprived. So it's possibly slightly dodgy. I suspect history will not be kind to it. But the big piece of legislation that's currently going through on levelling up is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which is fairly threadbare. I think it's fair to say it doesn't actually do much. It doesn't actually say much. But we'll see what they do with it. I'm not optimistic. It's a bit of a waste of legislative space, to be honest. But nevertheless. So yeah, again, this is another one that Liz Truss hasn't really said much on. She's been quite quiet on levelling up, which is strange given that it's such a major policy. I think it's probably because they don't know what to do with it. Levelling up is and always has been a slogan in search of a solution. It's a good slogan, but actually doing something with it is quite difficult. In fact, it's very difficult. And I don't think they've really got any ideas as to how they do it. The honest answer is if you are going to do it, you need a lot more money. And again, we come back to that question of where does the money come from? What she has said in various hustings, obviously it's quite a big one up north. She has implied very heavily she wants to do levelling up largely with deregulation and tax cuts. You will be noticing a theme here on the tax cuts score. Now, deregulation is an interesting one. Deregulation is something all governments like to do. Conservative governments particularly, they like to talk about deregulation. As they always find, and they are finding at the moment, as they try and untangle some of the EU legislation, most regulation is actually there for a very good reason. And actually getting rid of it is quite difficult because you might say, you know, we don't need this anymore, but actually it turns out you do because it's, you know, it's keeping people safe. It's also not very popular. If you tell people, oh no, we don't need working hours protection anymore, people are going to get cross about that. So yeah, deregulation, I fear, might be one of those. Obviously, free ports are now starting to kick off. They're very big on those. Again, I don't think they're going to be that helpful, but that'll be where I think a lot of the deregulatory focus is, which carries with it a whole host of other problems, because free ports they're a sort of good idea in principle, but they're actually quite difficult to manage and you get a lot of criminality in them. But nevertheless, again, free port's probably a topic for another discussion. But the other problem with not talking about levelling up, of course, is that levelling up was one of the very big sellers in the Red Wall up north. And they've quite liked, you know, a lot of those projects I was talking about. They've quite liked having those projects because it gives them something to point to their constituents. The MPs can say, you know, we've done this, we've done that, we've done the other, and Boris provided that and I supported it. I suspect those sort of projects, the big name branded ones, probably not going to be so much of a feature anymore because of the money situation. They cost a lot of money for quite limited sort of benefit. They benefit local areas well and they benefit local MPs, but actually they're kind of difficult to justify unless they have a much wider effect. So I suspect those will finish or at least slow their pace. That will lead to a bit of problem, I think, in the Red Wall when people try and square that. So it might be there's some quite truculent people on the back benches from the Red Wall seats, the 2019 lot, who are not entirely happy with that. But we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they will find the money for them and they'll keep ploughing it into those lovely marginal Conservative seats up there to try and desperately cling on to them. Immigration and rights is another big one. Immigration and rights, where to go? Immigration, she's very much wanting to continue the current policy, the trying to ship people to Rwanda. I note with some interest that the substantive legal case on that one started this week and has already come out with some quite interesting things. There's a lot of very interesting documents coming out of there. I am not going to speculate on which way the court will decide on that one and whether that's lawful or not. I'm not going to speculate on that. But I think I will say I think it'll be a very interesting judgment to read, and hopefully they'll make it nicely comprehensible, so even non-lawyers can get an appreciation of their thought on that. If it is stymied in immigration generally, of course, the way that will be done will be through human rights legislation, and I think we can certainly expect to see a lot of criticism from the government on that. They've already introduced their Bill of Rights bill, which is a really nastily named piece of legislation, to replace the Human Rights Act, basically. It's not a very nice piece of legislation. It's very much focused on reducing people's ability to challenge offences against their rights. They will continue with that legislation. I think that legislation will have a lot of trouble in the House of Lords. But obviously, if the government want to do it, there's a reasonable chance they'll be able to, depending on how long the Lords can delay it. So yes, expect more human rights shenanigans coming up as the government try and stop people from challenging deportations, things like that. Labour rights is the other one. Obviously, at the moment, we're having a lot of strikes in the UK. The rail system is out, which people like me is incredibly annoying because I rely on it to get around. So railways out. Obviously, the Royal Mail were out the other day. I saw them outside our local post office, briefly on their picket line, although they seem to head home pretty quickly, which I'm sure must be against the spirit of this thing, but nevertheless. Barristers as well is the other big one. Barristers are all out on strike, criminal barristers out on strike because of the lack of funding of legal aid. I very much in support of that one, although I do have lots of friends who are criminal barristers, so perhaps that's inevitable. But how has Liz Truss responded to this? Well, it's not by saying let's address the issues. It's by saying, right, we're going to crack down on that then. So we're expecting some anti-striking legislation coming through, particularly as it looks like Jacob Rees-Mogg is going to be appointed as Secretary of State for Business, Energy, Industry and Skills. Business, Energy. I can never remember whether it's Business, Energy, Industry and Skills or whether it's now Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I think it's the latter. but I can never remember because they change it so often. But yes, Jacob Rees-Mogg looks like he's going to get that job. I mean, presumably that means we'll all be in workhouses by the end of next week. But we'll cope with it. But he's very much of the anti workers' rights thing. So I think there's going to be a lot of challenges there. I just hope that people mobilise enough to deal with that. I noticed today, I think it was the TUC reported the government to the UN labour rights body. I wish people wouldn't do that. The UN is completely toothless on these things. It's a waste of time to all intents and purposes. But nevertheless, if that's the route they want to take. But I think that one again is one that will have to be handled very delicately because the public will not like it. The public will particularly not like it in combination with the Police Crime Sentencing in Courts Act, which was passed last year, which makes protest on the streets a lot more difficult and basically gives the Home Secretary the powers to basically say that protest can't happen. That one I don't think the general public have really noticed yet, though activist groups certainly have. I suspect that one might become more important and people might start paying more attention to that and might start being very unhappy about that. I think it's entirely plausible that we see quite a lot of civil unrest in the not too distant future over things that are happening economically, generally, morally. I think it's possible we might see a lot there. Culture wars. This is the other big one. Culture wars is an interesting one. Again, see, they're all interesting, these ones. Liz Truss is not really a very committed culture warrior. That being said, She has mentioned it a couple of times. She's talked about, trans rights, things like that. The usual swathe of things that nobody really cares about. I mean, this is the big thing with culture wars generally. The Conservatives are trying to make it into a big issue, except the public don't really care, and where they do care, they tend to be on the opposite side to the Conservatives. Trans rights being an obvious example of that. Renaming of statues being another one. Not renaming of statues, tearing down statues, renaming of streets, that sort of thing. Generally, the public is fine with that. The public don't want to have slavers on pedestals, So it's a weird one, that. But as I say, Liz Truss not massively big on that. But there is a big but here. 2 other people likely to be in the cabinet. Suella Braverman, the former Attorney General and former leadership candidate, in fact. Big culture warrior. Looks like she's going to be taking over at the Home Office. In fact, I noticed Priti Patel has, in fact, resigned this evening. But looks like she might be replaced by Suella Braverman. That one will be a big one because there will be a lot of culture war pushed there. Honestly, they're wasting political capital. They're wasting energy on it. The other big one is Kemi Badenoch. Looks like she's going to, again, former leadership contender. Looks like she's going to get education. Now, that one will be especially interesting to watch. There's been a lot of weird stuff going on in education around culture war at the moment. So, yeah, that one I think will be a very interesting one to watch. We'll see how that goes. And finally, I mean, I suppose the last point is foreign policy and Brexit. Brexit, no substantive change. Really, we're still dealing with someone who's very right-wing, very ideological for the moment. Might change, probably won't. Looks like the government she's going to be bringing in is going to be very much of that bent on that side of the party. Foreign policy, nothing will change here. Ukraine will still be getting weapons. They'll still be getting armaments. We'll still be helping that fight. But Brexit, the one place, of course, is Northern Ireland in Brexit. There already looks like they're having some trouble with that. They said they've been trying to get meetings with the Americans and with the Irish, and people like that have said no, not until you sort the problem. There was speculation Liz Truss might initially straight away trigger Article 16, which would be actually probably wouldn't be that bad because it would force them to go into negotiations with the EU again. It's just not going to do what they think it's going to do. But the other one is the Northern Ireland bill. I suspect they'll go down that route. Breaking international law again. We do that every day these days, so it doesn't really matter, does it? So yeah, that one is still going to be a huge issue. They're not going to get a resolution on it. They're too ideologically blinkered. They don't have the freshness of mind to be able to think about that one properly. So yeah, that one still going to be a big issue there. So that's a quick whiz through of the policy. Now we come to what to expect. So, whether you have faith in Liz Truss or not is a big question. I do not think Liz Truss is as stupid as a lot of people like to portray her as. She is very malleable. She is ideologically flexible, shall we say. She is not an idiot. She has intelligence. I don't think she's a very good listener. I don't think she likes hearing views that counteract hers, but she has ideas. Will they amount to anything? I don't think so. I think the Conservative Party of the moment is very much stricken with being in power too long syndrome. It doesn't have ideas, and particularly after 2019 and getting rid of, the resistance group on the backbenches, it also doesn't have the sort of intellectual backing. There is not really any strain of intellectual conservatism in there anymore. Used to be there was. You had people like Dominic Grieve and Oliver Letwin and Ken Clarke who could bring that heavyweight, I've actually thought about this. I've thought about how this works. They don't have that anymore. That's all gone. It's been replaced by loyalists. That's what the 2019 lot, the Red Wall lot, they were all sort of people who were selected for their loyalty and their refusal to challenge party orthodoxy. And party orthodoxy now has very much gone the direction of the more right wing of the party. So I don't think it's likely. I think she is going to very much struggle. The other reason I think she's going to struggle is that one of the things we've noticed over the course of the campaign she has a somewhat interesting reluctance to come under any sort of scrutiny. She's happy to stand up in front of the party because they can be guaranteed to sort of softball questions. She has been very evasive when it comes to interviews with journalists and confrontation with members of the public. That's a problem because you can't do that when you're Prime Minister. You have to answer to the public. The public will want to see you. They will want to see you arguing your positions. And I'm not sure she's so good at that. I think she's very much tried to avoid it. I think she's going to have a tough old time doing that. The other thing is not only does she struggle with that, the general public image of her is not great. You know, most people, if they know her at all, know her from her highly amusing take on pork markets and cheese being a disgrace. When the major public view of you is from a meme, that's a political problem. So this is why I would have liked to have seen a better performance from her in her leadership, her victory speech. If she'd have come out and said, like, now it's time to unify the country, be the statesman she pretends to be when she's doing her weird cosplay of Margaret Thatcher. If she'd have come out and done that, that would be broadcast all over the news and people will go, oh, okay, maybe she's got a chance. She didn't. She was robotic, she was bland, she was dry, not great. The public can look at that and go, she's not very good, is she? So yeah, not very good all round in terms of public image. And of course, this is before everything starts going downhill. We are still at a relatively high point in the disaster that is coming. And I don't think they've realised that, and they've not realised how she's going to look trying to deal with that. And particularly when you've got someone like Keir Starmer opposite you who is boring but is basically competent, that's going to look a big issue. It was notable that yesterday, I think it was YouGov published a poll looking at, relative places. Labour are 10 points ahead now. They did a poll. This was yesterday, so it was before we knew the result. Ish. I mean, we did know the result, but it was before we formally knew the result. Who would you vote for? Keir Starmer, Liz Truss. 17 points ahead, Labour. And this is the thing. She will get a bump in the polls because new leaders always do. And the average Tory one, and you look at past Tory leadership contests, the average poll bump is about 8%. Problem is, Labour are 10%, 10 points ahead. So it doesn't make it up. And this is before all the nonsense has started in earnest. So there's going to be a real problem there, and she's really going to have to do some hard work, I think, to try and connect with the public, and prove that she is willing to work for the betterment of the public, not just the Tory party. And the problem is everything she's done so far, understandably because it was the electorate she needed to appeal to at the time, was geared at the hard right, getting them all on board. And that's where, again, another place, the victory speech might have been a great place to try and appeal to a broader range of people, but she sort of didn't bother with that either. So, yeah, I think it's going to be a difficult one, no matter what. There is, of course, hanging over her as well, the Boris question. There's been a lot of talk about Boris wanting to make a comeback. Yeah, I think he'll try. I don't think he'll succeed. I think it'll be the PM he's been most likened to. It has always been David Lloyd George, who was also a dreadful PM and a philandering whelk. And Lloyd George very much tried that. He was kicked out by Stanley Baldwin in the 30s, one of my favourite PMs. And then he tried to make various comebacks, never amounted to anything. Never amounted to anything. I suspect it'll be the same with Boris. He has a few hardline supporters, but the general public, I don't think, would have it. And particularly given the last 6 weeks, he said, I'm committed to this job until I hand over, and then he's been on holiday for most of it, so he's not that committed, is he? So I think the really big question here is, the biggest question, honestly, is if the election is in 2024, does Liz Truss make it to that election? I don't think it's as guaranteed as she might like. I think a few poor performances in locals next year, if this winter is really as disastrous it looks like, we are talking winter of discontent levels of civil unrest. We are talking potential blackouts, energy blackouts. We've not had that for years, not on the scale we're likely to this winter. And they say it's not going to happen, but the fact that they felt the need to sort of soft pedal it and mention it as a thing tells me that actually we might be closer to that than we would like, and that they would like. So I think that's the big question. Hello, Glazzy. Welcome. If you have any questions, throw them into chat, and I will get them. So yes, I think it's a very big question. The biggest question, I think, is will Liz Truss make it to the next election? Having won, not cross that 60-40 boundary. I think you're right. I mean, this is the big thing. PMQs this week is going to be very interesting. It'll be first time at the dispatch box. She's all right in Parliament. She's not fantastic, and she's a bit boring and dull. So it'll be like a clash of the boring, dull titans as Keir Starmer dismantles her. But he is a lot more forensic. I mean, he's a former lawyer, former chief prosecutor. That's his thing. But yeah, had she got a 60-40 40 limit, Sunak probably would have gone away and gone, no, that's it, bad job. I think it's possible he might be back for another go if she does fall beforehand. But the other thing, of course, is that there is a lot of opposition on the backbenches to her. There's a lot of very powerful people on the backbenches, plausible alternate candidates for PM. You've got a lot of ex-ministers. You've got people like Michael Gove, who, whatever you think of him, is a really good political operator. He's really solid, really good debater. Obviously, there's been a bit of discussion about whether he's going to be an editor of The Times, I think it was, he was linked to. I don't know. He says he doesn't expect to be in government again, but he's a politician. They say things like that. But you've got people like, Jeremy Hunt. Priti Patel has now gone back to the backbenches. There's a lot of big, heavy hitters on the backbenches who could sort of solidify support around themselves and provide plausible alternatives. So that's why I think there is a big question here about whether she actually makes it to the next election. Glazzy, do the British like Churchill? Yes, we like Churchill. So Churchill is a really interesting character. Churchill is no doubt a hero. Without Churchill, we almost certainly wouldn't have... Well, we would have had a much tougher war, certainly. Churchill was also a dreadful, dreadful person. He was an awful human being. He was bigoted, he was rude, he was brusque. And I mean, particularly on the racism issue, a lot of people say, well, that was just his generation. No, even by the standards of the time, Churchill was considered to be extreme in terms of bigotry and being a bit racist and not very pleasant. So it's a complicated question, Glazzy. Do we like him? Yes, he's absolutely... I can only speak for myself, of course, here, but I think the general appreciation, yes, we do like him. He was a great man. And yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. Reading the other day, he had 84% and still lost in 1945. He did. I mean, and this is the thing with Churchill. Churchill was a very good wartime prime minister. Because he was slightly authoritarian and stentorian, and he could come and counter Adolf's ravings and rantings. Actually, as a peacetime prime minister, he wasn't very good because he wasn't very good at building consensus around things. He wasn't very good at putting lots of different things together. He wasn't very good at coalition building. Weird, given that he ran a coalition through the entire war, but nevertheless, but that was a very unique set of circumstances. So yeah, as soon as the end of the war came, he sort of fell apart. But I think people also wanted to change, and Churchill was very conservative in his views, even to the point of being reactionary. So I think people, after the war, it became very clear that society needed reshaping in a big way. And Churchill was never going to be the person to deliver that, and people knew that. And then he did come back, of course. He did do another term after that. But again, that was another, as a peacetime PM, really not that great. So yeah, it's a complicated one. Churchill, obviously, there's been a lot of late, has Churchill been cancelled and all this nonsense. It's all rubbish. It's part of the bigger problem of people not appreciating that history can have nuance. You can be a great person without being a nice person or without being a good person. And I think it's a bit of a result of an oversimplification of what we consider to be great. But I think generally my answer is yes, they do. But he wasn't a great person objectively. The historical record shows that he was not a nice man. So yes, so nice. I like that. I like my history. So yeah, absolutely that sort of thing. Do throw that in there. So yeah, I think it's possible Truss is going to face a bit of opposition. It's possible there's going to be some really big problems on the backbenches. There's going to be these little nodules of power with people lobbying. There is going to be a lot of backroom meetings of, if it all goes wrong, I'm still here, There's going to be a lot of that, I think. And it's sort of ironic, of course, because, Boris was one of the most powerful prime ministers, in terms of majority for a very long time, completely squandered it, couldn't do anything with it. Due to various things, not all his fault, but some of them were his fault. And Truss is not dissimilar. She's coming in with, still a 70-odd seat majority, but actually she looks very weak. As an incoming prime minister, even taking aside all the stuff that we know is coming down the tracks towards her, like a runaway train in a western with a sort of screaming lady on the tracks, she comes in very weak. She didn't make she didn't make the final two. She did, of course she did. She wasn't top of the MPs' votes. That's not happened before. She's got a lower degree of the membership vote than any leader since they implemented that system. She is looking quite weak, and the Conservatives don't like that. The Conservatives, they usually said to be like sharks. As soon as they scent blood in the water, they'll come in for the kill. Now Boris managed to avoid that because he played his charisma card. Truss doesn't really have a charisma card, and that I think is what the Conservatives are going to find. Actually, is that they're laboured with someone who has pretty much all the same shortcomings as Boris Johnson, but who doesn't have the charisma to sort of brush it off, laugh it off in the way that he managed to for so very long. And I think there's going to be there's already quite a lot of regret for getting rid of Boris. Honestly, they had to. He would not have been any use to them anyway. He was a busted flush by that point. But nevertheless, it's an interesting one. I suspect they're going to find that out. And actually, I think there'll be a lot of people regretting the way it's turned out, regretting the way it's panned out, which again accelerates this argument for, will she make it to the next election? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think there's a reasonable chance she doesn't. If she can do a year, that's great. But of course, if she doesn't, it just makes it worse for them in the next election, because then the new leader won't have enough time to build up their authority in time for the election. So yeah, it swings and roundabouts. They're just going to have to cling on tight and hope they don't get flung off the roundabout or the swing. And honestly, at this point, I think they're going to struggle to win the next election no matter what. I think whether it will be a Labour... I'm in two minds about whether Labour can scrape together a majority. I suspect it's more likely to be a confidence and supply thing with the Lib Dems. I don't think they'd go... I don't think they'd get into bed with the SNP, because it would come with the commitment to a referendum, and they don't want that, because you don't want to be the party that broke the union up. So yes, so there you go. That was a quick whistle-stop tour of the leadership, the new leader. So tomorrow I will say, actually, as a sort of final pseudo point, I very much appreciated that the Queen is making them both go up to Balmoral tomorrow rather than coming down to London. She's forcing them to go up to Scotland, which I find difficult not to read as a sort of prorogue this sort of, a slight on them. But nevertheless, yes, tomorrow about lunchtime, She will kiss hands with the Queen, not in a literal sense. There is no kissing of hands, but that's what it's called. And she'll be asked to try and form a government, and she will do. We shall see how it pans out. I don't know when the next one of these will be. We'll see how disastrous it is. If it's really disastrous, you might get one a week for the next the next half a year until everything sorts out. If you liked it, subscribe, like, whatever it is you do. If you want more from me as well, I should just probably put in if you just give me one tick. I do have a Substack as well, which you can subscribe to. I'll put a link to that in the chat now. He says, desperately trying, because this is something he should have done earlier. So if you like my stuff, it's reasonably cheap. It's the cheapest I could set it to. And I think you get a couple of free ones nevertheless. It's mostly about politics, bit of culture, bit of things I like, bit of history, bit of slightly more creative philosophical writing as well. So if you enjoy that, then do feel free to look at that. And if not, I hope I've seen we have new subscriptions in from people who've been. If you're not subscribed and you want to, then please do. If not, I shall see you soon. Keep an eye on my Twitter at Stephen J. A. Hill. Stephen J. A. Hill. That's J for Juliet and A for Andrew in the middle. I should say my middle name is not Stephen Juliet Andrew Hill. Andrew is correct. Juliet isn't. It's James. But at Stephen J. A. Hill, I always put up when I'm going to be doing these things, or when sometimes I play games on stream as well. So, yeah, I hope you have a wonderful evening. Wonderful rest of the night, I suppose. Wonderful rest of the week, and I hope to see you on these streams again soon. Bye for now.